Okay, so today I want to talk about shamanism, something that's very near and dear to my heart. I consider myself a shamanic practitioner. I've had difficulty in the past calling myself a shaman because there's a lot of, I guess, controversy around the term and around the term shamanism in general. There's all of these notions in modern society that if you're not a part of that culture that embraces a certain type of shamanism, then you're not allowed to participate in it. And to a certain extent, I think that that is true. There are some traditions and there are some shamans and peoples, cultures who don't allow outsiders to come in and view their rituals, don't allow outsiders to come in and participate in their rituals. Even if you're just talking about one guy in the middle of the forest somewhere, or, who does his rituals in a cave, and you hear about this person, he might not have anything to teach you. He might not want to teach you. He might not think it's for you. And a lot of that can be cultural or racial bias. Many people believe that these things are not for white people. I think that that's really short sighted, first of all, because there's also this notion that shamanism is essentially the base form of spirituality for all humans. If you go back far enough, and I don't even know what the term white people means anymore. But if you go back far enough, let's say in the Germanic lineage, then you're going to find people who practiced a form of shamanism. At least this is the common theory and the common idea, that if you go back far enough, you're going to find something that vaguely resembles shamanism. There's also the notion that even the term shaman shouldn't be used because it belongs to the Siberian people. It was a word, I think, that was first introduced to the common lexicon by Mircea Eliade, who obviously went and studied shamanism amongst the Siberians. And there's not just one, homogeneous Siberian people or culture either, or language. There are several. And so the term shaman just came to be used because we didn't really have a word for it before. We were just saying stupid nebulous terms like witch doctor and medicine man. Medicine man isn't a bad term. I think it might actually be a direct translation from some languages and some cultures. And the concept of a person who practices medicine, whether that is a spiritual medicine or physical medicine like a healer or a doctor, that's totally fine. But the word saman or shaman is apparently of Siberian origin. And so there are some people who argue that we should never call anybody a shaman anyway because they're not Siberian. Siberians own that word, essentially. I think that's really short sighted. Shamanism has come to just mean something fairly specific, and you look at all of these different practices around around the world in different cultures and different peoples, and it looks relatively the same. I think where it becomes very difficult in modern society is that we want every term to only mean one thing. We want everything to be wrapped up in a nice, pretty little package, and it just doesn't work like that. One thing I constantly think of when I'm, hashing out shamanism in my mind is playing D&D with my friends. And something I'm not very good at it, and one of the things that I constantly think about or forget really is what's the difference between a witch, a warlock, a shaman, a druid, a sorcerer, a wizard. There's all of these terms and they all have very specific meanings, at least in the game world, right? I still can't even define them just off the top of my head. And when I'm thinking about the spiritual world, it's much the same thing. What's the difference between a warlock and a sorcerer? Mostly it's just the word, you know? A sorcerer in real terms is very much like a shaman in a lot of ways. And if you go into the Meso and South American traditions, then sometimes, at least in Spanish, these people are called sorcerers. They're called brujas or brujos. And so it's just language, it's just semantics. I've gotten into arguments with people before over calling myself a shaman because I do practice a type of spontaneous shamanism. When I started having my spiritual awakenings, that is what happened to me. It wasn't something that I really sought out myself. It just became a personal path of shamanic experience. And I want people to understand that that is possible and to embrace that, even though by all outside appearances, I am just some random American white guy, you know? I didn't get into a debate or an argument personally. It was a second-hand or third-hand debate, I guess, that a friend got into with his girlfriend on behalf of me because she was very adamant that I was not allowed to call myself a shaman. This is a very young, maybe millennial or younger generation than that. We're very, very sensitive to these cultural sensitivities. They have a lot of cultural sensitivities. I have a lot of cultural sensitivities. I don't want to offend anyone, but I want to get to the heart of the matter. We don't have a better word for it. It's come into the common lexicon. Let's just use the word shaman, I don't want to do any discredit to the peoples who use that word. I don't want to do any discredit or disparage at all the cultures that engage in shamanism and might want to call their shamans something else. I don't want to take away from any of those cultures or any of those cultural experiences or any of those practitioners by calling myself a shaman when, in their eyes, I am probably something else. But in my own eyes, that's pretty much the only thing that I can define myself as. I could also define myself as a witch if I wanted to, because I do some witchy stuff. I could also define myself as a sage if I wanted to, because I do some sagey stuff. This is another problem that comes into play in the discussion about modern spirituality is everyone I talk to on this front lately seems to be super duper eclectic. They picked up this little practice from Buddhism. They picked up this little practice from yoga traditions. They picked up this little practice from Taoist breath work. They picked up this little practice from a shamanic workbook that they got in a library in Boulder, And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that this is a bigger question, a bigger discussion for modern spiritualists, which is to say we live in a time now where we have access to all of this information and even case studies and things, if you want to think about it in an anthropological sense, of all of these different practices, all of these different cultures from around the world. And we have the ability to look at them and say, hey, I think I would be able to engage in this practice. I would be able to do this. I might be able to adopt it and maybe even adapt it to my own particular style and use that. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. Of course, the hard part is when it just becomes a hodgepodge of, this eclectic mix of different practices and there's no honor given to those practices and people just become that sort of new age version of I just do whatever and I'm good with that. Or you become a dabbler, and that can also be dangerous too, because you're never fully committing to any one way, any one particular path, any one tradition. But again, in a modern sense, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, can we, as modernists, actually embrace these older traditions with our modern mindset? I don't think it's really possible. That's what's been so, in some ways, sick about the Western consciousness, is it's always observing at a distance. And any anthropologist these days, worth their weight in Gelvins, will tell you that you cannot do that from a strictly sort of scientific perspective, just observing an outside culture and write about it in an academic way and say, this means this, and this does this, and this person that. And it's even more impossible to actually participate in, let's say, some type of tribal ritual or whatever. You might be able to participate, but you are still participating as somebody who came from outside that culture. You're never going to have the experience of being one of that tribe, grew up in that tribe, who knows what these beliefs mean as a greater whole, how they serve the tribe, how they serve the individual, how they serve God or the Great Spirit or the ancestors or whatever it may be. You're never going to be that person. Maybe next lifetime, or maybe you were in another lifetime, but certainly not in this one. And you're certainly not going to be able to write an academic paper that gets at the heart of the experience of going through an ecstatic shamanic process. It has to be subjective, and that's not okay in academia. And I think because that mindset feeds so fiercely into our mindset, into our consciousness as Westerners, as maybe like light academics. Maybe we're not in the academic system, but we know what is required in order to have a proper opinion about this stuff, quote unquote proper, that we don't touch it. We know that we can't touch it, and that's just what it is. So the bigger question, or not a bigger question, but another big question for me is really, how do we put the pieces together? How do we form the new Western shamanism? What would that look like? Is it an individual path and everybody has to form it for themselves? Can we come together as a group and sort of make a new, what will be in several years, tradition? Because we don't have the traditions to harken back to. Or if I do harken back to the traditions of my ancestors, then am I really engaging in those traditions the way that they would have? I would argue that no, we can't do that. We have a completely different type of consciousness, completely different mindset, and it's really impossible to get to the heart of what they were practicing, what they were experiencing, what it really meant to them. And that is, of course, not to say that I'm not going to cast runes, and I'm not going to get into that, and I'm not going to tune in spiritually and energetically to those runes and the forces behind them and the powers that they contain and all of that. That is my own personal experience, and I embrace it fully, and as something that my ancestors would have done not too very long ago. And that, to me, is part of embracing a new shamanism, a new modern type of shamanism. One of the other things that makes this discussion very, very tricky is the idea of blood or genetics. I think as modern people, we're very wary of the idea of only people with a certain bloodline or genetic makeup are allowed to participate in certain practices and rituals and traditions. And you find it, this one always gets me, where some random white dude will say, oh yeah, my great 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 grandmother was an Indian princess in the Cherokee tribe, so I can totally participate in this ritual. And everybody else is just looking at him like, you're crazy, dude. That doesn't mean anything. Maybe 7 generations removed and you can go from black to white. Literally, it's that easy. But I think that what really matters is the base form of spiritual practice for all humans seems to be a type of shamanism, right? And so if we can embrace a new type of shamanism, then certainly it's open to everyone. Once again, I got into this discussion, or not discussion, but was witness to a debate that my friend had with his girlfriend, who was adamant that I could not be a shaman or call myself a shaman because I was a white guy. And I wanted to say, oh, really? That's all that matters to you, is it? So you're into pure bloodlines like the Nazis? And of course I'm not going to get that cheeky or, defensive or whatever. But it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's almost having the same conversation. You want to keep the bloodline pure. Yeah, that worked out in the past. Sounds like a great idea. The only people who are allowed to participate in this stuff are brown people. Doesn't make any sense either when you look at the Siberian genetic line or whatever. These are people who are, like Sino-Russian, like there's Chinese and there's that white European, considered white European mix to it. It doesn't make any sense to say that only a brown person is able to participate in shamanism. Also, if you really want to talk about blood, I'm half Mexican, bitch. So I've got the native blood. I can call upon that if I really want to get into this debate or whatever. Well, that's not good enough for you. My ancestors were Tejanos, and these native peoples who lived in central Texas all the way down to northern Mexico. If that isn't native enough for you, then I don't know what is. But really, I don't think that it should come down to, oh yeah, I'm half Mexican, so therefore I'm allowed to participate in this stuff. No, this belongs to everyone. Now, if I am trying to co-opt another culture's practices and I'm saying, what is the word, appropriating or misappropriating these practices and saying, oh yes, I'm an Andean shaman now or whatever. No, that's posturing, that's stupid, I'm not going to do that. However, again, from my roots in chaos magic and all of that, I'm constantly looking at the bare bones of the practices. What is the practice and why is it done the way it's done, and what is the purpose of it? If you go down to the bare bones of shamanism, there is the death experience, which one could describe as the death of the ego. Usually there is a use of psychoactive drugs, which is to say entheogenic plant substances, call them plant allies or plant medicine, that strips down all of the structures, ego structures in your mind, in your consciousness, in your brain, however you want to think of it. All of the concepts that you have about yourself, about the world, about other people around you, all of that is broken down in a shamanic experience. And you are left to put the pieces back together yourself. And what happens in those experiences is that you come out of it feeling like a newborn baby in a lot of ways. It is a death and rebirth experience. And that's a great experience. You can also have that same type of experience without the drugs in the yogic traditions. And they're constantly talking about stripping away the ego or getting away from the ego identifications, the egoic identifications that we have with objects in our world, with the objects of our reality itself. Another prominent feature of shamanism is working with spirits, contacting the spirits of the ancestors, the spirits of the dead, working with different nature spirits, with different elemental spirits. There's the concept of personal power in order to affect things in the universe, affect things in the world, affect things in our reality, which is basically the same thing as a magician who uses her will to get things done, to make things happen. There's also the notion of soul retrieval, picking up pieces of our souls that may have been scattered or fractured or missing. I don't know if it goes into the terms, multi-dimensionality, but going to other dimensions to pick up pieces of our spirits that might be causing us to not have all of our personal power in one place. And there's also a certain sense of participating with the flow of the world, participating with the flow of the earth, with the natural flow, with nature itself, which I'll get into in a bit. Another notion that's come up for me a lot is that still to this day there's a bias in Western thinking, whether you have it or not, that shamanistic practices are somehow more primitive than other practices. This comes, I think, probably from Mircea Eliade again, who was of the opinion that if psychedelic substances were used in a ritual shamanism, that culture or that tradition, that shamanic tradition, had become decadent. I love that word, decadent. It's like a culture becomes decadent when there's just all this unnecessary stuff and indulgence and pleasure and even like art and music was considered decadent to some people because it didn't serve a function to society. It's complete bullcrap, of course. When a religion or a shamanism becomes decadent, then I suppose it was engaging in the use of substances, it doesn't even make any sense to me, because I've studied this stuff for so long and I've had my own journeys for so long. I think that a shamanic culture that uses plant allies in that fashion is alive and vibrant and very much connected to the earth vibe in a very good way. That's not to say that there are some people out there who are charlatans. There's a lot of that going around these days. That's not to say that there are not people out there who overindulge in these substances, either recreationally, or they think that, I was guilty of this myself for a very long time, thinking that the simple act of imbibing something like psychedelic mushrooms was a spiritual experience. In a certain way, it was, even though I would have a horrible time in the process because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I did not know how to pick up the pieces of my own shattered ego or to guide myself through the process adequately. I thought all you had to do was eat the mushrooms and you were going to get to talk to God, you know. I never heard a voice. I never saw one hallucinatory image. I never saw colored lights. I never saw purple dots, which is very common with the mushroom experience. I have a very hard head when it comes to psychedelics. And yet what I was left with was, I don't know how to do anything. And I was just stuck in my room, in my parents' house. I was very young, you know, tripping on mushrooms with absolutely nothing to do, nowhere to go, and I was paralyzed. And it was that paralyzation that just freaked me out. And not recommended, you know, not recommended to do that kind of experience or to try that type of experience without a proper guide, without a shaman by your side. So there's also this notion that somehow traditions that don't use the substances are more pure, you know, and that, let's say, something like the yogic tradition is this higher form of spiritual practice because it does not engage in the ingesting of substances. I do not think that that is correct. I'm probably showing my own biases here. I'm not saying that your practice absolutely has to include them, but I think that they are a valid experience in themselves. The shamanic experience through the use of these plant allies and entheogenic substances, as I like to call them, is a very valid and worthy experience. All right. And it should be taken in its own context, in and of and for itself, outside of the context of something like the Brahmanic tradition or something like the yogic tradition, which eschews the use of all substances. And basically, you're not even supposed to eat proper food, you know, when you're doing these kinds of things. Like, you're surviving on a little bit of ghee, and you're constantly cleaning out your system to get rid of all of these supposed toxins and just surviving on amrita, essentially. There's a similar idea in Taoist practices where you're surviving off of the chi of the universe and the stuff that's flowing through your body naturally, and you want to get away from as many food substances as possible, because it's always thought that certain types of food produce certain evils, quote unquote, in the body, or certain bad spirits. I forget what they call them specifically, but you will see certain practices like the complete avoidance of grains and only eating some, like, you know, simple vegetables in a broth or that kind of thing every once in a while. Some Taoist shamans would even survive on a little, I'm saying shamans too, using that term kind of loosely in that tradition, surviving on just a little bit of rice wine here and there, or different pastes that they would make from roots and barks and things like that. Not really the way I want to go about living my life in a modern context, you know, because I like food. I like cooking food. I like eating food. Food is beautiful. I think that one of the things that's missed when we're talking about these spiritual practices and spiritual traditions is the most human thing you can do spiritually is just provide good food and drink and laughter and comfort for the people whom you love. That is a spiritual act in and of itself. And I want people to recognize that. I feel that very strongly, especially after having engaged in this stuff for so long and completely monked out in a cabin in the woods and, eaten vegan and tried to avoid all grains and all of that kind of stuff just so that I could ramp up my spiritual practices, my cultivation practice in a Taoist style, and came away from it going, you know what? I still like wine. I still like dancing around with my friends. I still like cooking a beautiful meal for people and having them just love and share and appreciate that. What could be more spiritual than that? So I want to make my little plug in the middle of this thing for shamanism that I'm recording right now, just because I think that sometimes gets lost when we're talking about these different traditions and these different practices. All of them are great. But I don't think, especially in a modern context, when we're talking about being eclectic spiritualists or whatever you want to call us in general, and taking these things from all these different traditions, we have the ability to tradition hop, and we have the ability to adopt one practice for a long time and get the good of it and then abandon it. Maybe not completely, but just set it aside for a little while and go back to eating the meat and drinking the wine and having the parties and being around people and all of that. Ultimately, in the Taoist tradition, once you have achieved the Tao, you can do whatever the fuck you want. You can drink all day long if you want to. It's not considered a bad thing because your system is so powerful that it's just going to, get rid of it and the next day you'll be fine, I guess. Yay, no hangovers, can't wait. But I just want to make a case for the idea that you don't have to be effing perfect in order to be a spiritual person, in order to walk the path. You don't have to kick yourself for smoking a cigarette every once in a while. You don't have to kick yourself for eating meat. You don't have to kick yourself for drinking a glass of wine every once in a while. Obviously, overindulgence is not a good thing in any capacity, and whether it's drugs or alcohol or food or sugar or grains or meats or whatever. But there is this serious bias, especially in pop spirituality these days, that you have to be a super vegan, you have to do yoga 16 times a week, you have to be cleansing out your system all the time and getting proper exercise. If you look at the shamans in South America, these are, no offense to them or anything, but very dried up husks of human beings sometimes. Even some of the yogis that I look at, I'm like, have you eaten a decent meal in your entire life, man? I am plump and happy at this point in my life, and I'm actually very proud of that because I just came out of the hospital last year and I was down to 130 pounds because, my normal proper weight is like 170, so that's like the thinnest I've been in a long time. I was very, very unhealthy. And when I look at somebody who looks to me to be very unhealthy, I have to ask why. Are you really gaining anything from going through these ascetic practices all the time? And denying yourself the stuff that makes us human. There's another notion, not just in the concept of this high spirituality, that you have to be super pure all the time in order to engage in it or go through these self-mortifications, essentially. But there is the feeling I see so prominent in modern spirituality and pop spirituality these days that people want to leave this earth. They want to leave their bodies behind. And I think that is extremely dangerous and misguided. From a spiritual perspective, from a high spiritual perspective, if you believe in reincarnation and you believe in the spirit or the soul's choice to choose this life, to choose this body, to choose your parents, crappy as they may be, to choose your living situation, crappy as it may be, to choose your ailments and your mental health issues and your this and that. You chose that. You are not the victim of an earthly existence and a physical body. You chose it. Okay? So from that perspective, you are doing yourself a spiritual disservice by wanting to get away from it. You did this on purpose. You wanted this experience for a reason. Now, I know that a lot of people have a difficult time with this spiritual argument, saying that, well, a soul would never choose to have cancer as a child. A soul would never choose to lose its mother and father. I would argue the opposite, very much so. If you remain in the stasis of everything is awesome all the time, then you never grow, you never learn, you never actually experience anything. This is again the story of Gautama Buddha, who was a prince and had every luxury and every physical pleasure and comfort in the entire world. And if he had not seen death and sickness and old age, then he never would have become the Buddha, because he would have remained in that stasis for the rest of his life, just content. Maybe when he started to age, and if he got sick himself, he might have asked himself those big questions, but it probably would be too late by then. One soul, a soul, has to experience these things, at least come into contact with these things to know what they are about. That is what the physical realm is about. I would never go so far as to say that it is all about suffering and we're supposed to be here just to suffer, but suffering is certainly a part of it. Going through trials and tribulations is certainly a part of it. It is not just a testing ground, it is a playground as well. And you do need to learn to laugh in the face of adversity if you can. That is a very spiritual experience. Of course, to me, it harkens back to the old Christian notions of you have this sort of absolution through suffering, or this sort of redemption through suffering. It can be a very dangerous line of thinking, because psychologically we slip into that victimhood mentality and that martyrdom mentality. And then nobody likes to be around those people who are just such victims of everything all the time, and they just love it. They love it. They crave it. You can just tell that for whatever reason it has been inserted into their thinking, their lines of thought through the years, that if you're suffering, you are better than everybody else. And so it's a simple psychological experience, if I'm suffering, then I am righteous. That's the word I was looking for. If I'm suffering, I'm righteous. Therefore, to the righteous, all things are just. I can do whatever I want. As long as I'm suffering, I'm good. And that's just not a good place to be. That is not what Paul meant by suffering for the Lord. I think it was, well, I'm not going to get into that whole discussion. That could be another episode. So I did get a little sidetracked there, talking about suffering and victimhood and martyrdom and whatnot. But I think it also plays into this notion of wanting to leave this earth completely. I had a friend who was going too far into his spiritual practices and doing energy work and meditation, all things that sound wonderful, but he wasn't eating, because there's this notion that fasting makes you more spiritual and that food bogs you down. And certain types of foods are poisonous, or that they detract from your experiencing real spirit. And it's a very disturbing experience to see someone who used to be a bodybuilder and pretty muscular and buff and healthy looking go to being a ghoul of a human being, a wraith, because he's lost so much weight because he's not eating food. Again, this is what makes us human. Food makes us human. It is the process that the physical earth, the physical world, the physical realm goes through. Everything consumes something on this realm. It'd be lovely if we could just, drink the nectar of the gods all the time and still be healthy and vibrant and all of that. Maybe we wouldn't want anything else, but it takes way too much effort to get there. And you can be fine eating a clean diet. Now, this notion of wanting to leave the body is, my body is disgusting. It's this trap. It's this, ew, gross, fleshy vessel, and it's full of fluids and things. And I want to fly out of my body and go be with my star family. That's where my true spirit lies. And this earth is a trap. And da 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 da. It's the same old version of the flesh is evil, but the spirit is holy. And I think that is just more bad than good in today's spiritual culture. And I would fully encourage everyone to embrace their humanity as much as possible, to embrace their earthly existence as much as possible. Just because you're doing that and you're remaining anchored to the earth does not mean that you are giving in to the trap or being a slave to, Otterman or whatever. Or I even see it in some shamanic lines of thinking. I have some people who are very close to the Toltec way and the Castaneda stuff, and they talk all the time about how it's this illusion, this dream of the world, and it's so terrible, and it's just like, it's just too much for me. It's too extreme. I don't like these extremes. I think people like Buddha and Jesus have taught us that extremes are not good, that we should be walking a sort of middle path. This is the most human thing you can do, but it's also the most spiritual thing you can do, and finding that balance and that harmony with nature, with the Tao, or whatever you want to call it, even if it means eating a cheeseburger. So without going too fully into my origin story, or whatever you want to call it, my awakening, which is also a pretty difficult term for me, my spiritual awakening, because we also have this notion that you awaken once and you're suddenly completely awake and that's it. No, we have several awakenings along the path. When it first all started to open up for me, I was engaging in a spontaneous movement practice. So you learn how to let these natural, earthly, or cosmic energies, I suppose, flow through you, and they move your body in random ways, and you start moving and flailing and vibrating and bouncing and that kind of thing. It almost, in a lot of ways, applies to something like ecstatic dance practices, except there are no moves. It's considered completely spontaneous, right? And what flowed out of having those experiences for me was a type of natural shamanic practice. I would sit in front of my altar and I would begin doing these spontaneous movements, and I would find myself magnetized to certain objects on my altar. So if I had a rattle, suddenly I would just like leap forward and grab the rattle and start shaking it madly. And again, this is spontaneous movement. It's a spontaneous occurrence of this stuff. So while I was in that spontaneous movement flow state, there's a good term because it very much is a flow state, things would suddenly happen. I would pick up the rattle. I would ding the bell. I would reach for the stick of sage and I would hold it between my hands. I would burn it on a candle for a little while, but I'd still be trembling and shaking and moving and having spontaneous vocalic utterances, and speaking that sort of light language and moving this stick around. And I would find myself, even, as I would have a pen and paper, I would draw certain symbols that would come out of me spontaneously. This is what I would call a type of spontaneous shamanic practice. Because if you look into a lot of the shamanic, I don't want to call it literature necessarily, but I guess there is a shamanic literature nowadays in a modern sense. You will find that there is always this sense of acting without knowing. In the Taoist tradition, it would be called Wu Wei, doing without doing, or acting without acting, something like that. It's also translated sometimes as non-action, which is not really correct. It means essentially acting effortlessly without forethought, So again, spontaneous action in a lot of ways. And to take that a little further, it is not just, you're doing things randomly just because, you have this impulse to do something, like pushing somebody into a lake because they're standing serenely near the edge of it and you're like, watch this. No. What it means is acting spontaneously in harmony with the Tao, or at least in harmony with nature. The really weird thing about that is acting in harmony with the Tao or in harmony with nature in order to imitate the Tao, because nature imitates the Tao. That's usually where we get that. Is that the Tao itself is spontaneous at times. There is no predicting exact weather patterns. We can get really close with modern technology, but when you're, a practitioner out in a little cottage in the woods and all you're doing is your cultivation practice, you may not know that a storm is coming. Acting spontaneously in accordance with the Tao really, to me, implies a certain energetic sensitivity, so that when you are doing a cultivation practice, when you are physically, energetically harmonizing with the earth, physically and energetically harmonizing with the air around you, with the atmosphere, with the heavens in a sort of cosmic sense, you are privy to those mysterious movements of nature, and you act in accordance with them. You will get that sudden tingle, that spidey sense that something is going to happen, and then you will take the according actions, even if it is chop wood and carry water because a storm's a brewing. That's a kind of weird example. More, I think of it as like this weird stuff that happens when you do become very energetically sensitive, where it's really hard to describe. When you become very in tune with those energies, sometimes you're so in tune that your body just does things. To me, this is an attribute of cultivating Shen energy, so spirit energy, like the highest form of qi that your body can process essentially before returning to the eternal Tao. When you have a lot of that energy moving through you and you've been harmonizing with it and cultivating it, you will find yourself doing things without even knowing that you're doing them. It's like an autonomic response. And so suddenly a spoon falls off the table and you don't even think, you don't even see it, you don't panic, you just go bloop, and you move your arm and your hand, and it just naturally, perfectly falls into your hand, and you put it back on the table, and you're like, oh, I didn't even know that was falling just now. It's that natural, There's this other sense of acting naturally. Mostly for me, at least in my own thinking, it comes from the Castaneda stuff, which is that you're supposed to act impeccably. You're supposed to act doing these rituals. Even if you make a mistake, you were supposed to act with no thought about that mistake, which is to say, I'm like, oh no, I made a mistake. Now I have to start over. God. No, it's like you made the mistake. Now that mistake is part of the ritual. It always has been from time immemorial and will be henceforth, And so you act impeccably. It's almost like, well, not almost like, it's very much like an actor on stage who embraces a mistake and just goes with it instead of, I'm sorry, can we start over? You can't do that in the middle of a play or something like that. You have to roll with the punches, right? And so there's also that kind of sense. And in a sense, being a shaman or a sorcerer or whatever you want to call it is very much like being an actor. Being a magician is like being an actor. You are putting on a play, putting on a scene for spirit, or for the spirits, depending on which ones you're working with. I think that style, this acting impeccably in your practice, is a little bit different from acting effortlessly, but the concepts are still very similar. There is this certain amount of spontaneousness. There has to be a certain amount of fluidity to everything, so that you see when shamanism becomes a more rigid, religious, spiritual tradition, it sort of loses its real essence, at least in my opinion. So in a lot of ways, when you're talking about these higher spiritual traditions, quote unquote higher spiritual traditions, like the yogic tradition, and eschewing certain types of foods, certainly eschewing certain harmful substances, certainly eschewing any psychedelics or entheogenic substances, in my conception of it, they have essentially fallen from the path in a lot of ways. Because these systems have become too pure, they have become too rigid, they do not allow for a certain spontaneity in them, and therefore they are not harmonizing with the Tao, essentially, or harmonizing with Brahman, in the yogic sense or whatever. That's just personal opinion. I tend to cling pretty strongly to my own opinions when it comes to spontaneity and flow within magical practice, within ritual practice, within the sort of spontaneous shamanism that arose within my own practices. And I love it. I can't imagine working any other way. I do set out prescribed rituals and things, and okay, use this mudra and use this mantra and all of that, but it's never so rigid that I'm doing it the same way every time. It's never so rigid that I don't allow for some spice in the mix. I think that the spontaneity that is a part of shamanism is also part of the ecstasy of shamanism. You'll hear that term a lot too, ecstatic shamanism or shamanic ecstasy, that kind of thing, which is, it is an ecstatic process or practice, meaning that it is outside of your stasis, outside of your normal state of being. And so they, let's say, ingest the Amanita muscaria mushroom, and then there's a fire, and there's much drumming, and there's smoke offerings, and the shaman is just dancing and singing and yelling and doing all this amazing stuff, this movement, and you can see it in their face, the brightness of the eyes, and they're participating in the mystery, and this is a wonderful, beautiful, ecstatic thing. And for whatever reason, that is frowned upon because of these higher, quote unquote, again, spiritual traditions that say that is primitive, that is indulgent, that is decadent. Because the only thing that you need to get you to spirit is to meditate in a cave naked for the rest of your life. No, it does not seem very fun to me. I've tried all of the things, and what I'm trying to do myself, still on this path of mine, this eclectic, weird little path, is trying to put the pieces together of what is a modern, spontaneous, ecstatic shamanism. And part of the whole point of my doing this podcast is to ask questions and to have a conversation with people. It's not just to preach at y'all about what I believe or what I've practiced and what I've experienced in the past and my personal opinions on these matters. It's to have a conversation. And obviously, just doing a podcast where it's just me talking is a one-sided conversation. It's not a conversation at all. So I very much appreciate feedback and comments and questions and all of that, because one of the other points in doing this podcast is I want people to get excited about spirituality. I think that spirituality is supposed to be exciting. That doesn't mean that it needs to be excitatory all the time, or that you constantly need to engage in these ecstatic shamanic practices in order to be spiritual or whatever. But I think that it's part and parcel with spirituality, with real, vibrant spiritual practice. We should be excited by the practices that we're engaging in. Nothing bores me to tears more than seeing a bunch of people all dressed the same, maybe in like really light white clothing or pastel clothing, and they're all just kind of like, you know, swaying back and forth and singing this weird kirtan or whatever in a language that they don't understand because they're not part of that culture. And they're all very happy, and that's great. And there's maybe it's a drum circle, and there's certainly something valid to that experience. But this is not an exciting spiritual practice to me. This is just getting together with friends and engaging in something that is in itself very much worthwhile. Believe me, having a drum circle is awesome. And you have this sort of connection and community and communion between all of the people, and that can be exciting in itself. But to me, that is not the point. That is not an ecstatic shamanic experience. That's not a full-fledged spiritual experience or direct spiritual experience. And once again, if we're really to create a new sort of Western shamanism and come up with a tradition on our own for ourselves, then I think that we need to get people excited about it. You know, it has to be compelling in a certain sense. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it here. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I hope you have been enjoying the episodes that came before this. What follows next is what I'm going to put at the end of the first 3-4 episodes, which is just an introduction to me and who I am and what I do and where I come from and all that good stuff. And thank you for listening.